The undergraduates enrolled in the course should have all received the second undergraduate paper assignment. And I wanted to begin today by asking if there are any questions about the assignment. Let me read it right now. It's very short and open-ended. Take any institutional proposal explored by the instructor with which you disagree in whole or in part and develop a better alternative to the problems that it addresses. Explain the reasons for your disagreement and for your alternative. Place your argument in the context of a particular country. Starting with the last point, it can be any country. It can be your own country if it's not the United States. And what I'm looking for is not a research paper, but an argument with a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's no need to do extra research, but you can certainly marshal whatever readings and arguments you want. So let me ask first whether there's any question about this assignment. I'm not looking for a research paper. I'm looking for the outline of an argument. And the argument is a programmatic argument. And therefore, with all the problems that we know in the present circumstance, a programmatic argument has. Any question? I suppose I should ask you at least 3 times whether there's a question. So, any question? Questions arise later, but you can always write to me and pose a question. Now, before I return to the agenda of today's class, I want to offer some unsolicited advice about your reading and your education. The most frequent defect in the education of educated people in the contemporary world is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy is the history of the basic ideas in our civilization, and a familiarity with the ideas of the great philosophers of the past is an invaluable intellectual asset. Copplestone's history of philosophy has the merit of being very detailed and not opinionated. Most histories of philosophy are like Bertrand Russell's history of Western philosophy. They're full of opinions, what's good, what's bad, what you should believe in, what you shouldn't. Copplestone isn't like that. He displays remarkable self-restraint. He attempts to give an accurate account of the major doctrines of the great philosophers. So it can facilitate immensely your own study of the history of philosophy. There are 2 main ways to study the history of philosophy. One way is this one, to read a general history that is general, but as I say, substantial and detailed. The professoriate in general is prejudiced against the reading of any secondary work. They say you should only go to the sources and so forth. I think this is ridiculous. It's absurd. The best histories of philosophy are enormously useful to your study, and there's no reason why you should confine your study only to the original writings of the philosophers. There's a second method which would complement this first method. The second method is to choose 1 or 2 philosophers, 1 or 2, and to read everything he ever wrote so that you form your mind in dialogue with his. Now, that won't necessarily be a philosopher with whom you sympathize. It may be the opposite, a philosopher whose ideas are the inverse of your own. So in my case, for example, I have enormous interest in the writings of Schopenhauer, but it's not because my ideas are like Schopenhauer's, it's because my ideas are close to being the opposite of Schopenhauer's. So you have to be guided by your own intuition of who can inspire you. But the background to this advice, which may seem strange to you, what to do, is a conviction that the more advanced your education, the further you go, the less you can expect to learn in school and in courses. The university is good at a few things and bad at many things. What any university, even the best universities in the world, are good at is to teach you particular skills, how to read German, how to solve problems in mathematical physics, and so forth. What the university is almost universally bad at is thinking and teaching you how to think and giving you a model of limit-breaking work. They don't do that. So the more you advance in your education, the more you have to teach yourself. And you can't expect to learn ideas, ways of thinking, fundamental ways of thinking and approaches in courses. That doesn't make any sense. So if you can find during your education 2 or 3 people who can inspire you, you should judge yourself extraordinarily lucky. It's not reasonable to expect anything more. This is the general advice I would give you. And so you have to be courageous and persistent, tenacious. Courage, of course, is not the highest virtue, but it is the enabling virtue, because without it, all the other virtues are rendered infertile. So it's necessary to be courageous and tenacious, to persist, and this is your best chance of forming your own mind and escaping from the gravitational field of your own time, your own circumstance, your own society. You don't need to study in school what the dominant ideas of your time are, which is what most of the professors want to teach you. You want to study how to resist them. And that's why you need, among other things, the history of philosophy. Would anyone like to question me about this advice? So Copplestone's History of Philosophy is 12 volumes in paperback. You can purchase them easily on Amazon. It's inexpensive. And it's a project for just a single summer. In a single summer, you can read all 12 volumes and begin your intensive reading of a philosopher and change your intellectual situation fundamentally. It's within your reach. It's entirely doable. Any question? All right, so what I would like to do in this class and in the next class, the agenda is the study of the knowledge economy. We have in the world now an insular and exclusive, socially exclusive version of the knowledge economy. And there is no project more important to the progressives in the contemporary world than the development of an inclusive and radicalized version of the knowledge economy. The vanguard of production in each historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production, a vanguard. And according to the opinion of the greatest thinkers about economics in the history of economics, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, the best way to understand the economy and its transformative opportunities is to study the vanguard, because it is in the vanguard that our potential, our human potential, is revealed most completely and fully. The knowledge economy that we have is confined to particular sectors and classes. That's why I'm saying it's insular. It exists in every sector of the production system. It is multi-sectoral, but it is insular as well as, and exclusive as well as multi-sectoral. It doesn't reveal its full potential precisely because it is confined to particular niches. It's only by radicalizing it, by deepening it, that we discover and reveal its full potential. So the theme in today's class and in next week's class is how, in the circumstances of the contemporary world, we can expect to do that. But I want to begin today's class by an indirect approach, taking two characteristic situations in the contemporary world, one of a developing country, a continental developing country, my own country, Brazil, and the other of a rich country like the United States, and using them as the starting points for this broader programmatic argument. And let me start the discussion of the developing country with the presentation of a dilemma. It's a very simple dilemma, but a very fundamental one. Until recently, there was another vanguard of production. The other vanguard of production was what the specialists call Fordist mass production. We also know as conventional industry, like the Rust Belt industries in the United States. The traditional industries that flourished and attained their apogee in the mid-20th century. This was the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and specialized work roles. This is the world of conventional industry. And until very recently, conventional industry was the core basis of the progressive parties. Conventional industry and organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. All over the world, countries are deindustrializing, at least deindustrializing from this conventional industrial paradigm. And the result is traumatic for the progressive political forces. That was their world. That was the world in which their core constituency was headquartered. The insular and exclusive character of the vanguard today has two major sets of consequences which immediately resonate for the left or the progressives everywhere in the world. One set of consequences is to slow down economic growth. To depress the ascent of productivity. And the other set of consequences is to deepen inequality, because inequality is now anchored in the chasm that deepens between the advanced and the backward sectors of production. The advanced sectors and everything else, because everything else is in principle relatively backward. Now, one country after another is deindustrializing. Brazil, the example I choose for today's discussion, is one of the countries that is deindustrializing most rapidly and radically. It has a misfortune or an advantage, depending on how you look at it, which is that it's extremely rich in natural resources, and especially rich in agricultural and ranching potential, and in minerals, in mining. And it has used this easy wealth of nature to compensate for its losses in industry. So the major market of the country is now China. China overtook the United States as our major market. And the basic trade of Brazil now is that we put relatively untransformed soybean and relatively untransformed iron ore on ships. We send these ships to China, and those same ships bring back to us all the products of the human mind. This has been a disastrous arrangement for the country, but it's kept us afloat. So the only reason why there's not a complete economic disaster is that we found this way to plug the hole and to replace what conventional industry offered to us until recently. Now, a country like Brazil, and there are many countries like this in this respect, one way or another, has then the following dilemma. What was until very recently the shortcut, conventional industry, has stopped working. The shortcut no longer works. So until recently, throughout the 20th century, the major teaching of development economics was, if you want to grow rapidly and achieve what the economists call unconditional convergence to the vanguard in the world, you should take workers and resources out of the relatively less productive sectors and put them in the relatively more productive sectors. In practice, that meant take them out of agriculture and put them in industry, put them in conventional industry. Now, that's precisely the arrangement that has stopped working. One of the reasons why it stopped working is that there's a new vanguard, that's what we're going to study over the next 2 weeks, which is able to outcompete the old vanguard. It can produce more stuff, less expensively, including the stuff that conventional industry used to produce. So the shortcut is blocked. What would be the alternative? The alternative would be to import or create a socially inclusive version of the new vanguard that has arisen in the world, the knowledge economy. But if that more inclusive version doesn't exist, even in China, or in Germany, or in the United States, or in Japan, how can it exist in a country like Brazil? So the task that is presented as the theoretical way to break the dilemma seems impossible to enact. The old path doesn't work. The new path seems inaccessible, beyond reach. That's the dilemma. And in the meantime, we found this surrogate for a solution, which is primary production and exports. That's an elementary account of the main problem of the country. So inside the country, aside from the agricultural and mining entrepreneurs, there are two groups or two classes. In fact, one class, really, that controls things. The financial rentiers, high finance. They finance politics and they buy the media. They literally own most of the media, so they control the public discussion. And the two major policies that the country has deployed to deal with its current situation are, first, to satisfy the interests of the financial rentiers by, for example, ensuring a very high rate of interest for the acceptance of the public debt. Public debt is now owned in the national currency. It's not a debt owed to foreigner. It's a debt owed to 10,000 families which receive a large part of the money of the state by being the creditors of the state. And then the economic surplus generated by the resource, by the natural resources and by agriculture, is dealt out to the masses in the form of transfer programs. So everyone is in some sense being paid. Naturally, the financial rentiers are getting 90% of the surplus, and the poor masses are getting 10% of the surplus. Meanwhile, there is a vital entrepreneurial culture, a new middle class or a new petty bourgeoisie that works desperately day and night but that for the most part remains confined to small, archaic, and relatively unproductive family business. In this small business class, or would-be small business class, a combination of petty entrepreneurs and what I call subjective petty bourgeois, that is, the horizon of aspiration is the petty bourgeoisie, even though their objective circumstance may not yet be petty bourgeois. Most people, most members of this group of petty bourgeois and subjective petty bourgeois have converted to evangelical Protestantism. So it's as if we had in the country a Trojan horse, and inside this Trojan horse are 70 million evangelicals that speak and live and entertain themselves as if they were Americans. So in the agro, they have all the features of American evangelical and petty bourgeois life. They have rodeos, they have country music. And they represent, it's like a version of the United States inside Brazil. It's about a third of the country now, almost a third, with decisive effects. And it is the social basis of something which we never had before, which is a right-wing politics. Until recently, all the politicians in Brazil pretended to be center-left. Although, of course, they weren't center-left. It was a kind of phony center-left. But that was the discourse of Brazilian politics. The ideal was what you could describe as a tropical Sweden, because the image that they had of Sweden, of Scandinavian social democracy, was the image of entitlements for everyone. In the line of the Weimar Constitution, of the 20th century constitutions, which promise a world of social and economic rights to everyone, without providing any of the institutional machinery that would implement these rights. So in the course of Brazilian history, and this too is quite typical of what happens in many parts of the world, we've never really had a productivist project. We had cycles of predatory extractivism. Lumber, gold, diamonds, rubber. That's the whole economic history of the country until the mid-20th century. And in the mid-20th century, we had what was our only true and quite successful productivist project, which was a version of what I just called before conventional industry, import substituting industrialization. So we developed a steel industry, an automobile industry, and it was one of the large industrial plants of the world in the southeast of the country, in São Paulo, with an enormous vitality of creative activity, entrepreneurial activity, vast migratory flows, millions of people coming from all over the world. We have, for example, in Brazil, more Lebanese, people born in Lebanon, or children of people born in Lebanon, than there are Lebanese in Lebanon. So, and the same thing with Japanese and from all over the world. Brazil has been a sponge. It absorbs everything. So the Americans think of the United States as a melting pot, but it's nothing compared to Brazil. And this also is associated with a trait of Brazilian culture, which contrasts with the United States. So Brazil is, I think, the country in the world that's most like the United States in many respects. It's a country developed on the same basis of European settlement and African slavery. Brazil was the last slave-holding country in the modern world, the last one to abolish slavery. But unlike the United States, radical racial miscegenation We have, of course, racial discrimination, but its presentation in the country is very different from its presentation in the United States. The whole population of the country is on a color spectrum, from black to white, in most of the country, from Rio up north. So there are many features of the society that would be hospitable to the project of creating a knowledge economy, an entrepreneurial, advanced knowledge economy with high productivity. Now, I said that we had only one genuine productivist project, which was the import substituting industrialization of the mid-20th century. The only project that was not an extractivist, predatory project. The only project that did not exemplify the main theme of our economic history, which is the divorce of mind from nature. Instead of mind marrying nature, we have mind divorced from nature. The only time that we escaped from that was in this period. Then the state formed a series of organizations, like, for example, the Agricultural Science Organization, that created the cognitive basis for a new agriculture. Until the mid-20th century, the subtropical savanna, which is now one of the great agricultural dynamos of the world, was regarded as inhospitable to agriculture. And now Brazil produces and exports more or less the same amount as the United States. It is, with the United States, one of the two great agricultural producers and exporters of the world, with a fundamental natural difference. We have 2.5 harvests, whereas the temperate countries have 1 harvest. A eucalyptus forest in Brazil grows 2 or 3 times as fast as a eucalyptus forest in Canada or in Finland. So this vast prodigal wealth of nature that lavishes and seduces us away from the task of establishing this marriage of nature with mind. So an inclusive knowledge economy would be a direct response to that challenge, and therefore it's enormous attraction and value for us. So this problem, this dilemma, is not peculiar to Brazil. This is the dilemma now for many countries in the world. How are we to do it? The state in the mid-20th century created these organizations that came to the assistance of the agricultural producers and created the basis for this agriculture. But the next steps would be to take the agricultural system and transform it. So let me suggest to you 2 characteristic forms that would take in 2 different regions. So one is the Amazon, and the other is the Center West, which is precisely the major agricultural frontier of Brazil. In the Amazon, we speak about sustainable development. The Amazon has the biggest reservoir of biodiversity in the world, and 20% of the sweet water available on the whole planet. A fantastic wealth of natural resources. But the Amazon is a chaos of land tenure. In the Amazon, less than 4% of the land in private hands has clear legal title. So the basic situation is that no one knows who has what. And in this circumstance of chaos, in which violence, coercion, land grabbing replace organized exploration of the land, pillage will always seem more attractive than either production or preservation. So the fundamental condition of sustainable progress would be the organization of land tenure. And sustainable development of the Amazon can only mean one of two things. It can only mean either a natural extractivism, like paying the Indians or paying the indigenous local populations to take care of the Amazon and to extract nuts and lumber from the land. Or the opposite, highly advanced, based on science and technology, with scale, with technique, and with this assistance of the whole world in the development of science. To give you a sense of how dramatic the situation is, almost all the forest technology available in the world evolved to deal with homogeneous temperate forests, not with heterogeneous tropical forests. The technology necessary to deal with heterogeneous tropical forests basically doesn't exist. We have to create it ex nihilo. And that's the situation even more so when we're talking about the pharmacological potential of this biodiversity, for example. So what's the practical consequence? The practical consequence is that it's either sustainable development of the Amazon is either a primitive extractivism without scale, without science, without technology, and therefore without a future, or it is a version of the knowledge economy. So it would look completely different from Silicon Valley and its platform oligopolies, but it's clearly, as we'll see, a version of the knowledge economy. Now let's go next door to the subtropical savanna, which is now this agricultural powerhouse to which I alluded, Center West. The predominant activity territorially, spatially, in that region is the same as the predominant activity territorially in the whole country. Low-intensity cattle grazing. And the consequence of low-intensity cattle grazing over time is the degradation of the land into degraded pasture land. That's most of Brazil. Most of Brazil's space, despite Brazil being one of the two leading agricultural producers and exporters in the world, most of the land is being degraded and rendered relatively infertile. Now, the science of the recovery of degraded pasture land is mastered. We know what needs to be done. And the cost is relatively low. So characteristic national project for this situation would be to recover the degraded pasture land and transform the recovered land in the physical platform of a new agricultural paradigm, which combined intensification of ranching, more cattle per acre, and above all, diversification of crops so we don't depend just on soy, and cumulative agricultural industrialization of the agro-pastoral products. And what's that? That's the first step. Those are the first steps of the knowledge economy in the primary sector. It's also the knowledge economy. So we would take one by one each region of the country, and in each region of the country, we would try to create this marriage of nature and imagination, overcoming the divorce of the two, depending on the particular circumstances of that region. I just gave the two most important examples, the Amazon and the Center West. Now, of course, the fundamental requirement for this is to have a state or statesmen who are able to think of the future and to sustain a project over many electoral cycles, to have a long-term idea of the national direction. So that sort of thing is the way to overcome the dilemma that I cited a moment ago. The shortcut is closed, and the alternative seems inaccessible. The dilemma can only be resolved on the second side, by making the apparently inaccessible task of creating an inclusive knowledge economy accessible, not in some one big swoop, but in little cumulative steps. And of course, for that to be possible, the project has to create its own base. Its own base is a version of that entrepreneurial petty bourgeoisie that goes up, that's uplifted in its capacities, in its vision, in its ambitions. By default, their characteristic refuge is the dream of backward, isolated, archaic family property. And as I said before, earlier in the course, all the societies in the world are class societies. How are we going to change that situation? This subjective petty bourgeois mass, which remains for the most part composed of poor people, are not going to be able to do this by themselves. It's necessary for there to be a division in the national elite. The elite in Brazil is mainly composed of rentiers, natural resource rentiers, or financial rentiers. There would have to be a division in the elite. There would have to arise in the elite a productivist counter-elite that opposed the rentiers and that sought power for itself and for its base. And that then in power offered the majority of the country, the subjective petty bourgeoisie, half of whom I said before are evangelicals in religious dissent from the majority opinions in the country, an alternative to their default vision of isolated, archaic, unproductive family business. There you have a simplified vision of the project, of a project, a characteristic project, suggesting one of the ways in which the knowledge economy would cease to be insular and would become inclusive. Now, this is a massive project in a country the size of the United States, larger than Western Europe, with all the confusions attendant on this in the contemporary world. Now let me stop there and ask whether I've given you enough substance, enough detail, for you can at least see or imagine the situation that I'm describing. So one of the curiosities of this situation is this. So the first project is this project of the marriage of nature and mind. The second project, the second label or the second slogan with which I would describe the situation is popular capitalism. Now, I don't believe, as a matter of social theory, you know that already, in the category of capitalism. I think it's a confusion. And it's one of the characteristic confusions of the progressives, to use the vocabulary of Marxist social theory without really believing in the assumptions of Marxist social theory. So all the bad assumptions are associated with the category of capitalism. What does capitalism mean other than a market order? In the United States, in the first half of the 19th century, between independence and the Civil War, in the North, the vast majority of white men were self-employed. They didn't work for another white man. It wasn't wage labor. It was a regime of artisans, of petty producers, of small-scale entrepreneurs. Is that capitalism? In the Marxist vocabulary, that shouldn't be capitalism. Marx said that the most fundamental trait of capitalism was that capitalism was the regime under which labor is bought and sold, wage labor. A regime of self-employed petty proprietors is not capitalism. So capitalism arose, so-called capitalism arose in the United States at the turning point in the 19th century, coinciding with the Civil War and its aftermath, when it became clear that the deployment of the new technologies in industry, for example, required aggregation of resources at scale. And the liberals and socialists, like John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx or Abraham Lincoln, who believed in property-owning democracy, were enabled to show how that regime was compatible with the aggregation of resources at scale. Then the corporation arose, and the banks. J.P. Morgan comes and say, You can't do it, but I can do it. I can do it by using big money. So the corporation, the bank, the plutocracy were able to cut the Gordian knot, which the liberals and socialists didn't know how to cut. So that's what determined the passage to this regime in which free labor ceased to mean self-employed labor and began to mean wage labor paid for by the corporation. And then there was this brief, apparently paradisiacal movement for the progressives, in which there was a core constituency of organized, stable, well-paid workers in the conventional industries, voting for the Democratic Party. And then that world was destroyed, less radically in the United States than in Brazil, but destroyed nevertheless. So that's the problem that's presented. And I'm giving you the Brazilian instantiation of it. Now, these economic questions are far from being the only questions. Yes.
Just a quick question. So there are some theorists who claim that we actually have moved beyond the capitalist paradigm and we're moving towards more feudalistic structures again in the digital age, because like big platforms are concentrating power, concentrating the infrastructure.
No.
So I just wonder, what is your take on this?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say, because this is a preliminary confusion that has to be dealt with. I think, especially for Americans, but in the world generally, the category of the knowledge economy suggests the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. And everyone who talks about the knowledge economy in the United States seems to be thinking of Silicon Valley. I think that the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley are not representative of the knowledge economy, even in the United States, that they are anomalies. And their enterprise, even though they are in value, they are now the largest businesses in the country. But they depend on a unique combination of characteristics. So first of all, the network effects. They run these platforms. And the social value of the platforms, not just the economic value to the shareholders, but the value to the society, depends on the universality of the platform. That's the reason why antitrust law, for example, is an inadequate instrument for dealing with the problems they pose. If you simply broke up the platforms, you wouldn't just destroy the value to the shareholders, you would destroy the value to the society. And that suggests that their problems, their dangers, have to be dealt with by changes in the law of property, the law of intellectual property, and the law of corporate governance, and not uniquely or predominantly by antitrust law. Now, second, the platform oligopolies depend on the unique, on their size and their vast pools of liquid capital to pay for the internalization of the technologies. Now we're witnessing this remarkable scene now in the United States in which it's as if the whole country were becoming a bet on AI. And the platform oligopolies are spending incalculable sums on, for example, these data centers that are necessary to implement what is now the major road that they want to take in their interest, which is a centralized version of artificial intelligence. GPUs with data centers and so forth. The third characteristic of the platform oligopolies is that they're totally dependent on this extraordinary feature of the near zero marginal cost of adding a customer or client to their universal platforms. So a touch of the button is sufficient to add someone. And the fourth characteristic of the platform oligopolies that is unique to them is that they're businesses that were created by ingenious businessmen profiting from a loophole in the law of intellectual property. The loophole in intellectual property is that they found a way to make money out of a commodity that's free, which is the data of their customers. And that's how they run their businesses. So I don't think that's an example of the knowledge economy. In general, that's an example of an anomaly that combines institutional arrangements, legal rules, and business models in a unique way. And in terms of the traditional categories of economics, the platform oligopolies are able to extract what the economists traditionally call rents. That's what a rent is in economics. You combine these features. So they've made a business. They made a business out of something that for them is free, and they've extracted these rents. So that has to be dealt with. The country has to deal with that, and be sure that it's able to take advantage of the potential of the knowledge economy without allowing the whole course of the knowledge economy to be dominated by these rent-seeking oligopolies. Now that depends on the direction. In the long term, that depends on two features I've argued before in the course, and return again to this argument, on two features. One is the evolution of technology and the shaping of the evolution of technology. On the other hand, the property regime. And the combination of the property regime with the logic of the evolution of technology is what will be fateful, what will be decisive. So now the dominant line is a line which has the following characteristics. These characteristics aren't intrinsic to technology. Technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. It has a logic of evolution that we give it. So the first characteristic is it prefers to develop technology in a form that lends itself to development and internalization by these firms with the largest pools of capital. As opposed to what? As opposed to being deployed to uplift the capabilities of the backward small and medium-sized firms and of the individual economic agents who have no stable relations to any firm. the technological equipment of those two constituencies does not require technology that's less sophisticated. It requires technology that's more sophisticated. So in the technical terms of the chip industry, it requires chips that are embedded or so-called on the edge FPGA technology rather than the centralized GPUs in data centers. It's a different technological line. Then second, in the middle term, in the medium term, the emphasis has to be on the equipment and empowerment of the worker, not on automation. The main theme of this logic of technological evolution is automation, the replacement of the worker by the machine. And in the long run, the direction is not captured by the idea of general artificial intelligence. It's not to produce a mind that's not to produce a machine that simulates the human mind, but to produce a machine that is as different as possible from the human mind, that has computational powers that the human mind lacks, so that we, the anti-machines, can then collaborate with the machine to produce something that's much more powerful than either of them could achieve. That's a different logic of technological evolution. And so there has to be a political struggle over the logic of the technological evolution. But its fertility, its impact, depends on its combination with advances in the law of property, in access to capital. Yes?
Yeah, just maybe a follow-up. So you mentioned these different property regimes, right, which could create a foundation for alternative economic and technological development.
Yes.
Historically, we've seen, for instance, the socialization of property, right, by the state. We've seen also commons, so shared ownership by communities of public goods.
Yes.
Do you envision additional forms of property?
Yes, yes. So I think, let me be absolutely clear about this. What I argue with respect to the future of the property regime is not that the market economy be organized according to one particular form, but that it be organized according to a large variety of forms. There's, analytically or theoretically, the most important thesis that emerged from the evolution of legal doctrine from the beginning of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th is that the market order has no intrinsic logic, legal logic. Not that there's one legal logic that's better than another one. So, for example, I think that the unified absolute property right of the 19th century has an enormous advantage for certain purposes. So it allows someone, the owner, who has absolute control of the resource, to do at his own initiative and at his own expense, at his own risk, something that no one else believes in. That's a huge advantage in property. But it's not good for many other things. So at the opposite pole of that spectrum is the idea of having an auction of capital. So who gets capital? Whoever can assure the fund that owns the capital the highest rate of return. There's an auction of capital. Now, there's nothing absurd about this idea, because this is the way that orthodox finance theory describes what supposedly already happens. Orthodox finance theory says a perfectly competitive finance capital market is an auction of capital. And those who can use the resource most efficiently end up getting it. So, for example, in the debates about the so-called spontaneous privatization of the assets of the Soviet state, in which the so-called oligarchs ended up seizing control of the major industries of the Soviet state. The defenders of the spontaneous privatization said, don't worry, it doesn't matter who gets these resources initially, because eventually they're going to end up in the hands of the most efficient users. Of course, this is a fantasy, but so the idea so the idea is some part of the resources of society, beginning perhaps with the resources in the public and private pension systems of the world, would be vested in these independent, competitive, professionally managed funds. Who owns them? No one. No one owns them. No one would own them. That is, they don't belong to the state. The democratic institutions design the regime of risk and return, or an array of regimes under which the auction would take place. And then we observe the results. So rather than committing ourselves dogmatically to one regime of property, we say we're going to auction off these resources on different time horizons, with different risk profiles, with different systems of relating risk to return, and then we'll see what happens. So we'll do it experimentally. So I'm not advocating that that be the only way in which the economic decentralization would be organized. I'm advocating the opposite. I'm saying there shouldn't be any one way. There should be a large range of ways, going all the way from absolute individual property at one extreme pole to the capital auction at the other pole, and with lots of stuff in the middle. That's what the ultimate objective is. Now, of course, before you get there, there are many intermediate steps along the way. And these are steps in which, for example, in the United States, in the organization of family-scale agriculture in the early 19th century, there was an effect of sharing. The state was involved in the design of the system. So it's not a substitution of one regime of capital for another. So the best thing would be to have, playing with the slogan or the word, a capitalism with no capitalists, because that's what this auction regime would be in effect. It would be a capitalism, in quotes, capitalism, borrowing the Marxist term or the anti-Marxist term, but there would be no capitalists, because no one would own these resources. So what's objectionable in the system of corporate capitalism is that J.P. Morgan is able to say, because I'm able to aggregate resources and you aren't, I get to decide what happens. And not only do I get to decide what happens, but all my children and grandchildren continue to decide and appoint whomever they want. That's what's objectionable. And it's not necessary to have it that way. Now, of course, we're not children. We all know that there's an enormous difference between sitting in the cafe and debating the Constitution of Poland like a French philosophe of the 18th century and actually entering a conflict in the world about who controls what. But that's the situation. So I've transitioned imperceptibly from the discussion of the Brazilian example to the discussion of the American example. Now, I don't think that the American executive elite is unaware of this. The other day, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, one of the 2 or 3 largest businesses in the world by value, said, the greatest problem in the United States is that there's no knowledge economy in North Dakota. It's a primitive statement of the idea that I just presented, but it is a statement. So the problem is that the knowledge economy is a fringe. And this fringe has to be everywhere for the country to be able to address and solve its problems. How is it to be everywhere? It can't be everywhere unless the logic of technological evolution and the logic of property rights are both challenged. But of course, we all know they're not going to be challenged outright, and all of a sudden, the question is, what trajectory of successive steps can begin to reconfigure them? That's the question. And I think that when I think now of the US example and the Brazil example, so the two examples I'm giving, they're actually analogous. They're variations of the same set of worldwide problems, but they're variations of the same problems. Ultimately, it's the same problem. Technology, property, and these nation states, which are class societies. So we're in the midst of this confusion, right? All of these places are class societies, pretending to be democracies. And they're armed states in a world of armed states on the verge of war. So that's the context. The context is very inauspicious, but the problem or the opportunity is very great. So I think that the issue is this. In politics, in real politics, we never think this way. We never think the way I'm trying to think here in the classroom, right? You think in a particular state at a particular time with a particular array of forces at your disposal. The experience in political engagement always is you're dealt a hand of cards. And you look at the hand of cards that you're dealt. And the first reaction always is, give me another hand. I don't want this hand. But you have to play with that hand. Now, we can't have a situation in which that way of thinking must exist. We must be able to think in that circumstantial and strategic form. But that can't be the only way we think, because if all the thinking is circumstantial and strategic, what's the basis for understanding anything? That is, there has to be another perspective on these problems, which is the perspective of universal humanity of the world and of the possibilities of humanity. So that has to exist somewhere, even if it's imaginary. And that's my aspiration for the discussion here in this little room, that we represent reason and humanity universally. There's a particular theme which I'm emphasized in the evolution of the modern world. And it's very clearly exemplified by what happened in the United States, more or less around the time of the Civil War. There were I repeat what I said earlier in the course. There were two regimes in the United States. In the South, there was slavery. The macroeconomic framework was English liberalism, paradoxically. The South adhered to free trade and to the doctrines of the English economists. In the North, the regime was property-owning democracy. It was a regime of artisans, of petty proprietors. No one, very few people worked for another person. And this represented a widespread desire in the world. All the people we admire today, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, Abraham Lincoln, all of them were defenders of this regime of property-owning democracy and self-employed petty proprietors and artisans. They were unable to show how that regime could be perpetuated against the forces that required aggregation of resources at scale. And as a result, the corporation comes, the bank, and says, I'll do it. I have to do it. I'm the only one who can do it. So we need an alternative to that situation. Now, it's as if we had this problem, we were defeated by the end of the 19th century. The predominance of wage labor as the main form of free labor had become naturalized throughout the world. But I'm arguing that under the conditions of the knowledge economy, as a result of this massive worldwide deindustrialization and the rise of the potential of the knowledge economy, we get a second chance. We get a second chance to do what the liberals and socialists failed to do in the 19th century, which is to create a real basis of decentralization and experimentalism. And that's the perspective from which I want to engage this argument about the knowledge economy. I think some version of this problem exists about now in just about every country in the world, especially in the middle-income countries. Maybe not in the poorest countries in the world, but in a vast array of contemporary societies. And I think we have to lose the prejudice against, for example, relatively primitive agricultural production. That's also the knowledge economy. That can also be the knowledge economy. We shouldn't associate the knowledge economy with Silicon Valley. So this is what's happened in the United States. All the governors in the United States, you know, just about every single governor in the United States now wants to have his or her own industrial policy. Everyone wants to have their own Silicon Valley. Even if the Silicon Valley is like a Potemkin village, it's like a Hollywood prop. It's not a real thing. Now take another example in the world. Take Russia. Russia has basically an oil and gas economy. All the rest of their production system is relatively primitive, with the exception of the defense industry. So they formed in association with MIT an organization called Skolkovo, which was supposed to be the vanguard, the representative of the knowledge economy in Russia, with the idea, with the ambition of creating the vanguard, the mind of their economy, and being able to lift it up, region by region and sector by sector. But for the most part, it never worked, because they were obsessed with looking always like a vanguard, looking like Silicon Valley, and obviously they can't. So tell me, is there some feature of this argument that particularly puzzles you? I don't want to just rush forward to other things unless we can identify what the source of enigma is. Now, these are far from the only problems in the world, but this is a vast problem with many different aspects. And just to signal that, just so it doesn't seem like a purely material economic discussion, let me recur to a point that I've made already several times. There are two main themes in modern social theory. There's the theme of domination or subjugation that Karl Marx addressed in detail. And there's the theme of union and disunion, which is the central axis of sociology, Durkheim. But there's a third theme, a suppressed theme in modern social thought, which is the theme of coldness. So, yes. I'm not talking loud enough? I can't even hear you, your objection. Yes. What? Yeah. So when I was saying that there are three themes, so there's the theme of subjugation or domination, which is related, of course, to inequality. And then there's the theme of union, solidarity. The third theme is the theme of coldness. So let me explain it by reference to the ideology of slavery. The ideology of slavery, both in Brazil and in the United States, was we're one big happy family. As preposterous as this may seem to you, that was the ideology. So the characteristic social relation in most societies in the world, combined in the same social relations, exchange, contract, power, so they were unequal exchanges. And then the third element was sentiment or allegiance, affect. So the characteristic relation between a slave owner and his slave, a boss and an underling, a man and a woman, was a relation that was an unequal exchange, sentimentalized. So you could call it the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. That was the dominant moral paradigm of the vast majority of societies and social relations, the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. So liberalism attempted to separate these domains. It said, exchange is for the market, power is for politics, and sentiment is for the family or private life. And that disaggregation, which is a moral disaggregation, produced an experience of coldness. So Schopenhauer described then the situation of humanity. It's like a bunch of porcupines in the cold night. They come together when they in the cold night to warm themselves. Then they hurt one another with their spines. Then they move apart, and then they get cold again. So they keep moving closer and further until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. That, he said, is the situation of humanity. So as societies became freer, they freed themselves from the sugar-coated regime of confusion, of contract, power, and allegiance, sentiment. As they became freer, they became colder. Now take a country like Brazil. The Brazilians want to be freer, but they don't want to be colder. And the whole history of evolution, of social evolution in modern cultures tells them you must be cold if you are free. Everyone who's free will become cold. You'll become like the Americans. And they don't want to. So that's the third theme, the suppressed theme, is this theme of coldness. How can they become, how can societies in this modern age become free without becoming cold? How can they become free but remain warm? So Talleyrand in the 18th century said, those who have not lived before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life. He was referring to this same moral logic of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. Now, in most of these great societies in the past, the basis of warmth in life among strangers has been an irradiation of family affect. The family is the headquarter, the anchor of warmth. And then, as in Confucianism, there's an attempt to impress upon a larger range of social life the warmth of the family. And I think that in a society like this, like our societies for the future, there has to be another source of warmth, which cannot be the family. The other source of warmth is the imagination. It's the imagination that has to light the fire. Because what is the imagination? The imagination has two crucial moves. One move is distance from the phenomenon, Kant says. A perception, and an image is the memory of a perception. So to imagine the phenomenon, you have to distance yourself from it. But the second, and to my mind, the crucial move of the imagination is to subsume the phenomenon under a range of possible variations in the space of the adjacent possible. What can happen next? That's how we understand anything. We understand any natural or social phenomenon by understanding what it can become next. What are the theirs to which we can get from here? Now, these institutions that I'm trying to discuss in the course are, to my mind, the collective manifestations of the imagination. A knowledge economy for the many, a high-energy democracy, the kind of education that I'm advocating. They are this fire of imaginative transformation. That's what the source of warmth has to be. That's how we can realize this dream of being free and warm at the same time, by organizing our social life so that the life of our institutions Our economic order, our political order become the tangible collective expressions of the imagination. But that's a theme that's in the background of the discussion. And it's related to the knowledge economy debate, because the knowledge economy is one of these sources, one of these ways of lighting the fire. So I think this is not a unique obsession of the Brazilians. I think this is a universal desire of humanity. Humanity wants to remain warm as it becomes free, and doesn't settle for the coldness, for the porcupines, for Madame de Staël saying, societies will arise in which there will be full of meetings that deprive us of company, deprive us of solitude without affording us company. That's the coldness. And we don't want the coldness, and we shouldn't want it. So I think that's it's obviously in the real world we don't get to do that, right? We don't get to talk about banks and then talk about warmth. But that's the advantage. So it seems to me we should have the advantages of our disadvantages. If we're not going to taste power immediately, at least we should be able to dream. Question? So I think that the next thing I should do is insist on, I'm afraid that in criticizing Silicon Valley as the default option of how to think about the knowledge economy, I risk leaving the idea of the knowledge economy vague. So I'd like to now make an effort to render the description of the knowledge economy precise. So any practice of production reveals its potential only as it spreads across the economy. So insofar as the knowledge economy is an insular vanguardism, a confined vanguardism, it doesn't reveal its true nature. It's a compromised form of a project. That's what Nadella didn't take into account when he said, why isn't there a knowledge economy in North Dakota? Because he spoke of the knowledge economy as if it already existed, as if it were already a perfected paradigm. And the only problem is that it's missing in North Dakota. But that's not the only problem. It's missing in San Francisco also. It's missing everywhere. We have it only in a distorted, perverted form. It's perverted even for its immediate beneficiaries and owners, not just for those who are its direct victims or excluded from it. So at the technical level of what's called the technical division of labor, the knowledge economy has two characteristics. So the first characteristic is to combine production at scale with customization. And this isn't a secondary theme. This is a theme directly connected to this debate that we were just having about the turning point in the 19th century. So up to now, up to the 20th century, the theme has been, the premise has been, if you have customization, you can't have scale. You have either one or the other. That's why a regime of artisans and petty proprietors couldn't achieve mass production. Now the idea is we can do both. Our technologies and our work practices allow us to combine customization with scale. And if you look at all of the productive regions that in Europe, for example, were the vanguard of the knowledge economy, they all have this background of artisanal production that prepared them for producing in a craft manner, but at scale. North Central Italy, Southwestern Germany, Catalonia, and so forth. In other words, post-Fordist manufacturing was prepared by a history of pre-Fordist economic production. The second technical aspect of the knowledge economy is that it combines decentralization of initiative, and discretion and power in the work team with the maintenance of cohesion, of momentum. So that's the military analogy which I gave before. It's like the difference between a traditional infantry brigade and a special forces operation or a guerrilla operation. The technical ambition in the knowledge economy is to relativize the contrast between task-defining roles and task-executing roles. And as a result of relativizing the contrast between planning and execution, you also relativize all the specialized work roles. So the combatant, the special forces combatant, is an active participant in the revision of the battle plan. And that requires, of course, a transfer of power from the command structure to the rank and file. So the moral culture of traditional, conventional industry production and of traditional markets is a moral culture of command and control. And the moral culture of the knowledge economy in this direction that I'm describing requires a relative elevation of the level of discretion and autonomy which is allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. So the traditional conception of the market is the conception of the social theorists, like Simmel or Max Weber, is a market is a form of simplified cooperation among strangers that may be unnecessary when there is high trust, but that is impossible when there is no trust. So it depends on the generalization among strangers of a modicum of trust. That's the moral culture of the traditional forms of economic organization. The more advanced forms of organization require an elevation of the level of reciprocal trust and discretion, allowed and demanded of all participants in the process of production. So there's a moral transformation that is intimately associated with vanguardism. Now we go to the deeper level of characteristics of the knowledge economy. And I want to argue that there are three deeper characteristics. The first has to do with what may be the only genuine law in economic life, which is the law of diminishing marginal returns, often confused with something completely different, which is constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale means that if you increase proportionally all the inputs to a process of production, the output goes up proportionately. Now, constant returns to scale is not a law, although it's often described as it is. A larger factory may be more or less efficient than a smaller factory. Constant returns to scale is the conceptual equivalent of constant motion in Newtonian mechanics. That is a default assumption which has no law-like status. Anything that happens can stop it or change it. Diminishing marginal returns is completely different. Diminishing marginal returns means if you hold all the inputs to a process of production constant and you change one input, you elevate one input, the returns to that input will rise, plateau, and then eventually fall. That's the most universal law in economic life of which we are aware. And the economists were always fascinated with it. It was a subject of fascination with the classical pre-marginalist economists, and the marginalist economists weren't able to understand it. So it is the regularity in economic life that has the greatest claim to be considered a genuine law. But what is its basis? Now, I want to argue that the basis of this law of diminishing returns to scale is the punctuated character of innovation. So think of it this way. Innovation is not a constant flow. Innovation is mainly imported from outside the production system, from the development of science and the development of technology. And it is punctuated. Because it is punctuated, each innovation counts as if it were a separate input. And you can then see how the return to it rises, plateaus, and falls according to the law of diminishing marginal returns. If innovation were a constant flow, a constant stream, it wouldn't be like that. There wouldn't be this rise and plateau and fall. There'd be endless rise of productivity. After all, that's one of the fundamental mysteries of economic life. Why doesn't economic growth occur exponentially and without limit? Why doesn't every increase of demand produce an increase of supply? And every increase of supply, an increase of demand. It should go back and forth infinitely, and it doesn't. So what happens then under the knowledge economy as it becomes radical and universal? What happens is that innovations start to become as if they were a constant stream. And the reason why they're a constant stream under the conditions of an advanced knowledge economy is that they're not just imported from outside, from technology and science, from the evolution of technology and science. They're endogenous to the production system itself. Because production becomes constant experimentation and tinkering. To the extent that that happens, to the extent that innovation ceases to be punctuated and becomes a constant stream, the law of diminishing marginal returns, which is the most universal and rigid law in economic life up to now, may be modified, suspended, or even reversed. So I would say that's the deepest characteristic, a deeper characteristic of the knowledge economy compared to the previous conventional forms of vanguards of production. So from that standpoint, we could divide the economic history of humanity into three great periods. The first was the period in which the constraint on economic growth is the existence or the lack of a surplus over current consumption. And that probably only prevailed until the beginning of civilization. Karl Marx and Adam Smith both thought that the coercive extraction of a surplus continued up to their own time. But it's not true. We have reason to think that in all this historical period already, innovation was the decisive constraint. Innovation or the lack of it, and not the coercive constraint, extraction of a surplus. The coercive extraction of a surplus was decisive only in the most primitive conditions of accumulation. In every civilized society that did have a market order, and all of them did have market orders, the dominant constraint was the lack of innovation. Every innovation, conceptual, technological, institutional, every innovation produced a response subject to the law of diminishing marginal returns. So then the second period in the economic history of humanity is the period in which the coercive extraction of a surplus ceases to be the decisive constraint, and the decisive constraint becomes innovation, or the lack of it, the lack of innovation. Then the third period is the period in which this law is subverted, this law of diminishing marginal returns, because innovation becomes continuous or loses its episodic character, and it becomes continuous in large part because it becomes endogenous to the system of production itself. And that's us, that's now. And by the way, even if that happens, or it has happened, it still doesn't produce the situation that Keynes and Marx predicted, which is overcoming scarcity. We still have scarcity, but now we don't have this constraint of the law of diminishing marginal returns to the extent that innovation becomes continuous. So I say that's the first of three deeper characteristics of the knowledge economy. The second is that under the knowledge economy, the best firm becomes like the best school. Production becomes a laboratory, a permanent laboratory. This phenomenon that I was describing of endogenous innovation. And knowledge-based production becomes permanent experimentation with practical productive results. The third deeper characteristic of the knowledge economy is that to the extent that the knowledge economy becomes generalized and universal, the moral basis of production changes. It ceases to be that command and control among strangers that I described, And there is an elevation of the level of reciprocal trust and discretion. So it's not an in-group of insiders who have affect and allegiance to one another, but the basis changes from low trust to high trust. There is an association between high trust and vanguardism. And the people who study the different forms of the knowledge economy, who, for example, compared Silicon Valley to Route 128 in Boston, there's a monograph about this subject. And the argument of the monograph is the main difference between the two worlds, accounting for the relative success of Silicon Valley and the comparative failure of Route 128, is that in Silicon Valley, there was a much higher degree of circulation of people, resources, ideas, and experiments among the firms, a regime of cooperative competition, and an elevation of trust, exemplifying the association of vanguardism with high trust. That was the thesis. So the conception of the knowledge economy, for which I want to argue, is that the knowledge economy is this combination of characteristics. The superficial ones I described at the start, the deep